Now, there have been many critics of the government's approach to tackling coronavirus. We just heard from one of them there, but few have been more vocal than the former Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir David King. He's even set up his own group of scientists who've called themselves Independent Sage to give some alternative advice to that provided by the government's official committee. And Professor King joins us now. Thank you for being with us. Now, you've done an estimate, haven't you, of the number of deaths that you fear that we could see in the next 9 months. Can you just explain what it is you've been looking at and what you found?
Well, thank you, Sophie. Let me start, if I may, by segueing into the previous discussion. Scotland, Ireland and Northern Ireland are successfully nearing zero COVID. And that is what we're calling for now, that Britain as a whole should demand zero COVID UK. Now, what does that mean? What we're saying is 27,000 excess deaths are likely between now and next April. If the expectation by the Chief Medical Officer that he would be surprised and delighted if the UK is in the same place next spring, if he's correct, then we would still have about 2,000 to 3,000 new infections in England per day, and that is the number of deaths that would follow from that. Now, quite clearly, what Independent Sage is calling for is, first of all, this is an almost entirely preventable and absolutely unacceptable. It's immoral. But let me also add, in response to your question to the previous speaker, it is best for economic recovery. The quicker we can get down to zero COVID UK, the more quickly we can get a full economic opening of our economies right across the United Kingdom. It looks as if the policy is to maintain the current level of about 3,000 new infections a day across England, while Scotland, Ireland and Northern Ireland are heading towards zero, net zero. And of course, it just seems to me very self-evident that that is the right policy. Let me just say, if we take the last 3 to 4 weeks, when we began to soften the lockdown and talk about it, and we saw that the rate of infection falling was actually then slowing down, and now it's stopped over the last 2 or 3 weeks. Now, over that period, if the disease had been spreading at a roughly halving every 5 or 6 days, this would mean that we would have achieved a halving from 3,000 to 1,500 in the first week, to 750 in the second week, to 375 in the third week. That is the normal means of getting an epidemic under control. And at that point, we have the ability to test every single new case.
OK, I am going to try and butt in with a question here, if you'll forgive me for that. You're talking there about a zero COVID target, but I'm interested to know how exactly is that achieved? Because of course we'd all like to see zero COVID, but it clearly would mean a pretty strenuous and significant lockdown. And you were saying there that actually there's an economic benefit to preventing a second wave, which of course I accept. But, you know, I've just been to Birmingham this week talking to a theatre where she said 70% of theatres, for example, facing insolvency by Christmas. Job redundancies coming out now. There is an economic cost to not lifting lockdown now as well, isn't there? Surely you will accept that.
Of course I accept that, but of course part of that is going to be driven through by government policies to reduce the furlough scheme and so on. So let me say at once, Independent Sage is very sensitive to all of these issues. We believe that we ought to look at returning to school as a priority and then creating safe mechanisms for doing this, perhaps requisitioning playgrounds, whatever. We need much more out-of-the-box thinking on dealing with priorities. I fully understand publicans who would like to be getting back to full operation. But I would also advise anybody, publicans included, only open up that area of your pub where people can be outdoors and serve people outdoors so they're not brushing into each other going into the pub. There are means of achieving these objectives, but we have to be patient. And if we're not patient, of course, it's not just a second wave, as you're saying there, but if it bumps along at 3,000 a day, that is what produces this additional 27,000 deaths and we haven't yet then opened up our economy. So if we want to return to full economic growth as quickly as possible, get rid of the COVID virus.
Pretty sobering, the idea of all those extra deaths, of course. Now, you clearly feel very strongly that the UK government is going down the wrong path. I mean, you even feel so strongly about it that you've set up a rival advisory body to give alternative advice. So do you think that the scientific advice is wrong that the government are getting, or do you think they're just ignoring it? And as a result, I guess, who should resign?
I don't think there's any difference between the scientists on SAGE and the scientists on independent SAGE. I think the difference is that we are in the public domain. You're talking to me and not to the chairpeople of SAGE, precisely because they're not free to come and be cross-examined by the media. And frankly, that is the way to gain the trust of the public in the policies that the government wants to lay down. The whole issue is extraordinarily challenging. And by the way, we're not providing an alternative to SAGE. What we're doing is providing an independent voice for the public and the government to listen to in this mechanism. When I was Chief Scientific Advisor, whenever I could, I was out in the public domain explaining my advice to government and then explaining, but it was government that made the policy and made the decisions.
At the same time, though, just to come in, there is a divergence of views among scientists. I spoke to, for example, Sir Mark Walport on the show very recently, who was making the point that the government needs to try and weigh up the economics as well as the virus infection rate, and that, broadly speaking, he understood the policy decisions that they were making.
Well, I mean, I simply don't understand what Sir Mark is saying there. Are we saying that this is the reason why we went into lockdown so late, much later than every other country, but during a period when the disease was doubling every 3 to 4 days in this country? If we'd gone into lockdown just a week earlier, we already would have had a much better chance to get out of the pandemic. And we also, by the way, would have had a quarter of the number of deaths we've had. So I completely disagree with him. We need to look at the fastest route out of COVID-19, and that is not the fastest route. And that it means a better economic recovery as well. It's just not right.
I'm just going to squeeze in one final question. We are out of time, so I'd appreciate a brief answer if you could. But Ian Blackwood was talking about the possibility of stopping people from England or Wales travelling to Scotland without a quarantine, potentially if the infection rates continue to be lower in Scotland. Would that be a good idea?
I think that the whole question is a disastrous follow-through from the failure of the English policy to do the same as the Scottish and the Northern Ireland and Ireland, for that matter. We are all an island nation together. We're not using that as our mechanism for controlling. Okay. We should be, the government, discussing this with the heads of the other nations.
Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. It's much appreciated. Thank you.